The second reading is from Judges chapter 16, beginning to read at verse 1. Judges chapter 16, beginning to read at verse 1. One day, Samson went down to Gaza, where he saw a prostitute. He went in to spend the night with her. The people of Gaza were told, "Samson is here." So they surrounded the place and lay in wait for him all night at the city gate. They made no move during the night, saying, "At dawn we will kill him." But Samson lay there only until the middle of the night. Then he got up, took hold of the doors of the city gate, together with the two posts, and tore them loose, bar and all. He lifted them to his shoulders and carried them to the top of the hill that faces Hebron. Sometime later, he fell in love with a woman in the valley of Sorek, whose name was Delilah. The ruler of the Philistines went to her and said, "See if you can lure him into showing you the secret of his great strength and how we can overpower him, so that we may tie him up and subdue him. Each of us will give you 1,100 shekels of silver." So Delilah said to Samson, "Tell me the secret of your great strength and how you can be tied up and subdued." Samson answered her, "If anyone ties me with 7 fresh bowstrings that have not been dried, I will become as weak as any other man." Then the rulers of the Philistines brought her 7 fresh bowstrings that had not been dried, and she tied him up with them. With the men hidden in the room, she called to him, "Samson, the Philistines are upon us." But he snapped the bowstrings as easily as a piece of string snaps when it comes close to the flame. So the secret of his strength was not discovered. Then Delilah said to Samson, "You have made me a fool. You lied to me. Come now, tell me how you can be tied." He said, "If anyone ties me securely with new ropes that have never been used, I will become as weak as any other man." So Delilah took new ropes and tied him with them. Then, with men hidden in the room, she called to him, "Samson, the Philistines are upon you." But he snapped the ropes off his arms as if they were threads. Delilah then said to Samson, "All this time you have been making a fool of me and lying to me. Tell me how you can be tied." He replied, "If you weave the 7 braids of my head into the fabric on the loom and tighten it with a pin, I will become as weak as any other man." So while he was sleeping, Delilah took the 7 braids of his head, wove them into the fabric, and tightened it with the pin. Again she called to him, "Samson, the Philistines are upon you." He awoke from his sleep and pulled up the pin and the loom with the fabric. Then she said to him, "How can you say, 'I love you,' when you won't confide in me? This is the 3rd time you have made a fool of me and haven't told me the secret of your great strength." With such nagging, she prodded him day after day until he was sick to death of it. So he told her everything. "No razor has ever been used on my head," he said, "because I have been a Nazirite dedicated to God from my mother's womb. If my head was shaved, my strength would leave me, and I would become as weak as any other man." When Delilah saw that he had told her everything, she sent word to the rulers of the Philistines, "Come back once more, he has told me everything." So the rulers of the Philistines returned with the silver in their hands. After putting him to sleep on her lap, she called for someone to come and shave off the 7 braids of his hair, and she began to subdue him, and his strength left him. Then she called, "Samson, the Philistines are upon you." He awoke from his sleep and thought, "I will go out as before and shake myself free." But he did not know that the Lord had left him. Then the Philistines seized him, gouged out his eyes, and took him down to Gaza. Binding him with bronze shackles, they set him to grinding corn in the prison. But the hair on his head began to grow again after it had been shaved. Now the rulers of the Philistines assembled to offer a great sacrifice to Dagon, their god, and to celebrate, saying, "Our God has delivered Samson, our enemy, into our hands." When the people saw him, they praised their God, saying, "Our God has delivered our enemy into our hands, the one who laid waste our land and multiplied our slain. While they were in high spirits, they shouted, "Bring out Samson to entertain us." So they called Samson out of the prison, and he performed for them. When they stood him among the pillars, Samson said to the servant who held his hand, "Put me where I can feel the pillars that support the temple, so that I may lean against them." Now the temple was crowded with men and women. All the rulers of the Philistines were there. And on the roofs were about 3,000 men and women watching Samson perform. Then Samson prayed to the Lord, "Sovereign Lord, remember me, please. God, strengthen me just once more, and let me with one blow get revenge on the Philistine for my 2 eyes." Then Samson reached towards the 2 central pillars on which the temple stood, bracing himself against them, his right hand on one and his left hand on the other. Samson said, "Let me die with the Philistines." Then he pushed with all his might, and down came the temple on the rulers and on all the people in it. Thus he killed many more when he died than when he lived. Then his brothers and his father's whole family went to get him. They brought him back and buried him between Zorah and Eshtaol in the tomb of Manoah his father. He had led Israel for 20 years. This is the word of the Lord. Thanks be to God. Let's pray. Our Lord and God, we thank and praise you for your great love shown to us. And we pray, Lord, as we open up this section, this portion of your word this morning, that you'll teach us much about ourselves and about you. Help us to understand the nature of sin, that we might be better equipped to fight against it. All to the praise and glory of your name. Amen. Please do be seated and turning your Bibles to Judges chapter 13 through to 16. We will look at together this morning. In the film The Last Samurai, I don't know if you've seen it, it builds to a final, very moving scene. You've got this captain, Nathan Ogren. He's played by Tom Cruise. He's a cynical veteran of the American Civil War. And in the final scene, he comes to present the sword of the last samurai who died fighting for the honor of Japan. And as he presents it to the emperor says these words, "Tell me how he died." To which Nathan Ogren replies, "No, I will tell you how he lived." The idea being that the man's life, it wasn't encapsulated in his death, his honor wasn't encapsulated in how he died, but in the manner that he'd lived his entire life. Now, this week we come to Samson. Samson is the last God-appointed leader in the book of Judges. And if someone was to ask the people at the time, "Tell me how Samson lived," they would probably reply with a little bit of embarrassment and say, "Actually, could I tell you about how he died?" Because the way that he lived with his life, we sank to new depths of depravity. You know that we were talking about this cycle within the book of Judges. The people have peace. They rebel against God. God judges them, sells them into the hands of their enemies. They cry out to God. He raises up a judge. The judge delivers them. Then they have a time of peace. But that cycle is also spiraling down. And with Samson, we've reached new depths of depravity. In this one man, we see the flaws of God's people, writ large but on small scale. See, Samson's life begins in a barren, what was a barren womb. And then if you read chapter 13, he's supposed to live a life abstaining from wine, but he certainly doesn't live a life restrained from women, as you read in chapter 14 and 16. But then we get this crazy episode with 300 foxes and the wheat harvest that you can read at your leisure at home in chapters 14 and 15. So this first stage of his life I've entitled An Empty Womb, No Wine, Lots of Women, and a Wheat Harvest. You see, in Samson, we have the most flawed judge. And in this, he gives us an accurate picture of what Israel is like, but also he gives us an insight into what sin is, the nature of sin, in order that God's people know what they're up against, what they're battling. See, for the last time in the book of Judges, and we read the phrase, the Israelites did evil in the eyes of the Lord, chapter 13, verse 1. And instead we get another phrase. In those days, everyone did what was right in his own eyes. That's in chapter 17 and chapter 21. You see, in Samson, we have a disturbing picture of what life is like when one man decides to do what is right in his own eyes. You see, he has a lot to teach us about sin. And here's the first lesson about sin. Sin always appears right in your own eyes. Evil in the eyes of the Lord and right in your own eyes are very different statements, completely opposed to one another. I don't know if you saw that dress that caused that online frenzy. There it is. Did you watch it? Apparently, millions and millions of people were looking at it. I saw the dress, absolutely convinced that it was gold and white. And then everybody in my house said that it was blue and black. Everybody else. And apparently, people were divided all around the world on what they could see. Well, God looked down on Israel's actions, and he says, like, I look down on your actions, and I see evil and unfaithfulness. And Israel said, well, that's interesting, because we look at our actions, and we see good and faithfulness. Completely contrasting views of how they viewed their life. Why? Because sin always appears right in your own eyes. We so easily slip into justifying our behavior based on how we feel about it or how we see it. It feels right, so it must be right. It looks good, so it must be good. But sin is not ultimately, it doesn't ultimately consist in violating my own conscience or violating my own personal standards or even violating the standards of the community I live in. Sin consists in violating the standards that God has set up, that God has given through his revealed word. Whether something is right in my own eyes or not has very little to do with whether it's right or wrong. See, my own eyes is not the way to determine right and wrong. Have a look at this picture. And what do you think of it? What do you make of that picture? That picture was part of an art project to make ugly things look beautiful. So you take a pipe that deals with sewage that comes from your house, you put some pixelated things of sort of fresh water around it, and suddenly you've taken something that was ugly and made it beautiful. Or have you? Well, the 17th century Puritan Thomas Brooks, he said this: Satan paints sin with virtue's colors. Now, what he meant by that is that Satan commissions the finest artists to paint sin so that it looks attractive. That's what he did in the garden with Adam and Eve, and that's what he's been doing ever since. He paints sin with virtue's colors. See, whether something looks right in your own eyes, whether something looks right in the eyes of your friends, whether something looks right in the eyes of the majority, or whether something looks right in the eyes of the nations, is of no consequence to Christians. Because what matters is whether it is right in the eyes of the Lord, whether the Lord has determined that it's right. With this deliverer, if you read chapter 13, this deliverer that's born of a barren womb, the kind of expectations of what Samson might do are heightened. Remember, all of the judges have been chosen later on in life. This judge is chosen before he's even conceived. And so there's this expectation that something great is going to happen. Maybe we're going to have the best deliverer, the real deliverer, who's going to deal with our greatest enemy. Maybe that's what we'll have in Samson. But instead, what we find is the most disturbing judge in the book, a violent, impulsive, sexual addict who's emotionally immature. See, Samson is not only stirred by the Spirit of God, and you read that 3 times in this section. But he's also stirred by his impulses, by worldly desires. Because that's the second lesson we learn about sin. Sin is stirred by worldly impulses. The judge Samson, instead of fighting Israel's enemies, instead decides to sleep with them and marry them. Why? Because he thought it was right in his own eyes. That's the literal translation of the Hebrew. When he comes down and he wants this Philistine lady, and he says, because she is right in my eyes. I've determined that she's good for me. See, throughout Samson's life, these 4 chapters, we discover a guy who acts based on his impulses and passions. But of course, his impulses and his passions arise from the fact that he is a sinful man. He has a sinful nature. You see, when we get to chapter 16, and Samson tears apart this lion, this beast, that's a picture, no doubt, of what he's going to do to the Philistines, the beast of the Philistines, that he will tear them apart. But it's also a picture of what Samson is like. You see, Samson is a brute beast. He acts based on his inner desires and passions, irrespective of any kind of reason. See, Samson was born of a barren womb, and sin is born out of a barren heart. A heart that no longer has the life of reason within it, but it just follows its worldly and fleshy desires, irrespective of what God's word says. If we're going to conquer sin, if we're going to battle against sin, then we must resist the pulling and pushing of our passions, irrespective of what reason might tell us. See, when we do that, when we see things as right in our own eyes, that's what sin does, and then we follow our worldly and fleshy impulses, we end up being unteachable. That's what sin does to you. It ends up making you unteachable. Samson is unteachable. In chapter 14, his parents come telling him what he should be doing, reminding him of his vows. And what does he say? Well, he just dismisses their instruction, their teaching. It doesn't matter to him. And in this, he's a perfect picture of Israel, isn't he? What have we seen with Israel time and time again? Oh, they reject God's teaching. They turn away from God and go their own way. See, sin hardens you. Sin hardens you so that good advice bounces off the bonnet of your armored-plated heart. All too often, when I come across someone who I'm seeking to help, members of the congregation who have done things that are right in their own eyes, they've followed their impulses and desires, I know that the next step is that they'll be unteachable. They will not respond to good, sound, biblical advice. See, Samson and Israel is a picture of Israel, possess a hardened heart, unteachable spirits, so that God has to stir up the Philistines. Did you notice that in chapter 14, verse 4? It said they did not realize that this was from the Lord, because the Lord was looking for an opportunity to provoke the Philistines. See, what has happened is that Samson and Israel have become so entwined with the Philistines that God has to use severe measures to sever this unholy union. They're so unteachable that God is going to have to use the sin of the judge to start to separate them out from the ungodly. See, sometimes severe measures are the only options remaining for God to wake up his people who have become unteachable. Sometimes it's God's severe measure in your life that is his strongest grace to you to wake you up from an unteachable spirit. But sin also makes you forget who your real master is. Did you notice that the judge's cycle is broken? What's the missing element that we've seen in weeks before? Well, there's no crying out to the Lord. The Israelites do not cry out. Why? because they have settled in their slavery to the Philistines. They've become comfortable with it. So comfortable that Samson himself thinks nothing of marrying a Philistine woman that was forbidden. And in chapter 15, when God uses Samson to stir things up with the Philistines, what did Judah do? Did you notice that? Chapter 15, let me look at that for a moment. Chapter 15, verse 11. Basically what's happened is Samson has stirred things up with the Philistines through his sin, but it's stirred up nonetheless. The Philistines send out an army to go against Israel. Then Judah sends out 3,000 men to meet Samson, who is hiding in this cave in Etam. And now you might expect that as those 3,000 people go out, that Judah, you remember chapter 1, Judah? Judah is the brave tribe. Judah is the one who goes up first. Judah is the one who conquers God's enemies. And you expect that Judah might come out and say to Samson, okay, Samson, we're right behind you. You provoked the Philistines. Let's go get them. Here's what they say, chapter 15, verse 11. Then 3,000 men from Judah went down to the cave in the rock of Etam and said to Samson, don't you realize that the Philistines are rulers over us? What have you done? They say to Samson, wind your neck in. These are our masters. The Philistines are our rulers. See, that's what sin does. Sin makes you forget who your real master is, and you start thinking that you're sin's loyal subject, that sin is your ruler, sin is your master. You become settled and comfortable in sin. But there's no such thing as a harmonious coexistence between believers and their sins. Between Israel and the Philistines, between Samson and the Philistines. Where there is no conflict, it is because you have sold yourself over to a new ruler. There must be conflict. That's what God is saying in these chapters. There must be conflict. And God will do every means to stir up conflict. Samson, you can't lie in the bed with Philistine women. Israel, you can't bed foreign gods. And he says to the church, you cannot be married to the church, to the world. And I will do every means to stir up conflict. And individual believers, you cannot coexist harmoniously with your sin. I will do everything to stir up conflict. And where there is no conflict, it is because sin rules over us. We have a new master, and we've traded in. Well, now to the second stage of Samson's life, which revolves around doors, Delilah, Dagon, and death, and more lessons about sin. To this point, Samson is killed about 1,000 Philistines. But in doing so, he's killed 1,000 Philistines, but he's not liberated the people from Philistine oppression, nor has he brought Israel towards obedience to the Lord. In fact, what we find is all his actions have been self-serving. By the time we get to the end of chapter 15, Samson has escaped the Philistines' clutches. He served Israel for 20 years. But here the cycle is broken again, because what do we usually read? That the Israelites had peace for 20 years. But no, what we get is he served Israel for 20 years. There's no peace. No peace. And so what does he do? Verse 1. Well, then, one day Samson went down to Gaza. Not just to a Philistine town, but to a Philistine capital. He goes down to Gaza where he saw a prostitute. Do you see what I mean about sin makes you unteachable? He's learnt nothing. Chapter 14 and chapter 16 run parallel. Whether it's the woman in Tamar or whether it's the Philistine prostitute or Delilah. They both just run parallel. He's learnt nothing. See, here's another lesson about sin. Sin makes you play silly games. Do you notice that? Samson toys with his first wife, Tamar. Remember, it revolves around a secret. You've got this riddle of the lion, and then you've got this secret about his strength. Both passages revolve around secret. And he toys and he plays with the woman, his wife at Tamar. He toys and plays with the Philistine. Then he toys and plays with them in the walled cities. He pulls off the doors. And then he toys and plays with Delilah. That's what sin makes you do. Makes you play these silly games. He thinks he can play this game. It's a dangerous game. And he eventually gets hurt, doesn't he? The game is, I'll play around with the pleasures of sin while not getting trapped in the pains of sin. That's what he thinks he can do. But no, Samson plays the game and he gets hurt. And God's message to Israel is, look, you're playing the same game as Samson. They're supposed to look at Samson and he's supposed to be seen as this ridiculous character. Why would he do these things? Why would he put himself in that situation? And God is saying to Israel, because that's the situation you put yourself in. And it's the same situation we put ourselves in as well. We play the game and we get hurt. See, Samson, he went to the heart of Philistine, and he thought he could do that without Philistine getting into his heart. And he was wrong. And we think the same thing. We think somehow we can press deep into sin, and then we can go to the heart of enemy territory, and we can be there, and somehow we'll always come off unscathed. Just think about how confident Samson would have been. He goes to the capital. He sleeps with a prostitute. He's in a walled city. They come to get him, and he tears off the doors, and he carries them up to the hill facing Hebron. And he must have thought to himself, I'm unbeatable. I can play these games, and I always come off unscathed. And then he'll play it one more time with a lady called Delilah. And he'll move from doing what's right in his own eyes to what? Having no eyes. Because you'll play the game once too often, and you'll get caught out, and you'll get hurt. He couldn't control it. He wasn't in control, was he? See, the trouble with Samson and with Israel is that they couldn't stand against the seductive voices of the women that they chose to bed. Here's another lesson about sin. Sin is a siren, and if you listen to its voice, it will lure you to your death. As you listen to these accounts of these two women that revolve around a secret, what the narrator is trying to get us to do, and I hope what was going on as you heard chapter 14 and 16 read, is that when he fails in chapter 14 and he gets caught out by Timnah, who gets him to tell him, the secret to him, by the time you get to Delilah, what are you wanting? You're thinking to yourself, well, surely he won't get caught out a second time. Surely when this lady starts asking for his secrets, you'll think, oh, been there, done that, got the T-shirt, I think I'll leave it alone. Or even if he hasn't learned from the first time, maybe, Samson, maybe, by the third time the Philistines have come upon you, maybe you'll stop opening your big mouth to Delilah. Oh, but no. Why? Because sin is a siren's voice. It's seductive. It's sweet. And he listened to Timnah and he listened to Delilah, and he put himself in a dangerous position. In Greek mythology, the sirens, the picture on the screen, they were dangerous and yet beautiful creatures who lured sailors to their death. Their voices and their music were enchanting, and the sailors would come across, and the ships would get wrecked on the rocks near their island. And then some people said that the sirens would feast on their flesh. You see, sin operates in a similar way. If we allow sin to have a constant voice in our life, then it will direct the way of our life. That's what happens. See, Samson was deceived. He kept heeding the voices of the ones who intended to hurt him, and yet he'd come back for more. And Israel was deceived. They kept heeding the voices of the ones who intended to hurt them and came back for more. And yet, how often do we heed the voice of sin that intends to hurt us, and yet we come back for more? Just like Samson with Delilah, same old questions, same old sin, over and over again. And when will we wake up to the fact that these siren voices lead to death? See, why are we giving sin a voice in our lives? Another thing about sin. Sin blinds you to the truth. There's a great irony in this story because Samson was blind a long time before he got his eyes gouged out. Did you notice that? As you read through, he's spiritually blind. Blind to what's going on around him, blind to the danger that he's in, and then he ends up physically blind. See, that's what sin does. It blinds you and makes you do the most ridiculous things. See, when Delilah finally knows that she's got the secret, and she goes to her paymasters and says, look, you can come get him. The sleeping Samson is there. He has his hair shaved, and his strength leaves him. And then we get this very strange thing in verse 20. Look down, chapter 16, verse 20. Samson knows that he's told Delilah the truth. When he wakes up, look at that hair on the screen. He must have known that his hair had gone, okay? This is not Richard Hawes. If Richard Hawes had his head shaved in a nose, he's not going to notice it, is he? Okay? But some people, if they wake up with no hair, you're going to know that it's gone. Okay? Samson has never had his hair cut. He knew that he told Delilah the secret. He knew that his hair had gone. And what does he say? I will go out as before and shake myself free. Because he did not know the Lord had left him. Why? Because he thinks no matter what he does, he can always rely on God to deliver. And in this is a picture of Israel, isn't it? Israel has always said, no matter how many times we break our vows, God will always deliver. Samson has been breaking his vows all his life. When he eats that honey from the lion, that's not just incidental. He shouldn't have been eating from a dead carcass, okay? That makes him unclean. But he didn't care because Samson always did what he liked. And he always thought that it didn't matter because God would always deliver. I'll go out just as before and shake them off. Well, you won't, Samson, because God has left you. You've played around in sin, you've toyed around in sin, and God has left you. Sin blinded him to the truth, just like sin blinded Israel to the truth. Samson was unable to see how dependent he was on God's grace. He thought that what he'd got was his right. I have the right to be strong. I have the right to be the judge. Israel thought, we've got the right, where they have the right to be the people of God. You see, the contrast between the Philistines and Samson at this point is absolutely amazing. The Philistines are convinced Samson must do something to have his strength. And we need to find out what it is. Samson, on the other hand, says, I don't need to do anything to have my strength. I don't need to do anything. No, you do, Samson, because you're God's judged, and you're tied into a Nazirite vow with God. You do have to do a lot of things. Let me say one more thing about sin from this passage. Sin makes you focus on self. Sin makes you focus on self. The Philistines have gathered to celebrate. They want to praise their god, Dagon, who, as far as they're concerned, has delivered Samson into their hands. They have this song, don't they, verse 24, our God has delivered our enemy into our hands, the one who laid waste our land and multiplied our slain. It's one of those songs that's theologically suspect. It might have had a really good tune to it, but the content and the lyrics are a bit dubious. You see, it was the absence of the Lord's strength, not Dagon's power, that had delivered Samson into their hands. Samson is there and he's been shamed. But his shame becomes the Lord's shame. His shame becomes Yahweh's shame. For the praise that belongs to the Lord alone is being heaped at the lifeless feet of this image, this helpless image, Dagon. Samson is shamed, but the Lord is shamed. And what does Samson care about? Did you notice? What does he want in the end? After all his life, what has it taught him? In that moment, what does he want? Revenge for my two eyes. Lord, strengthen me one more time that I might get revenge for my two eyes. What about the Lord's honor, Samson? What about the Lord's glory, Samson? What about the Lord's name, Samson, that's been profaned in your life and in the life of Israel? No, give me revenge for my 2 eyes. See, sin makes you focus on self. Even at the end of his life, it was nothing about the Lord, it was all about him. He turned inward on himself. That's what sin does. It turns you inward on yourself. But in all these chapters, the real contest is not between Samson and Delilah or Samson and the Philistines or the Israelites and the Philistines. It's between the Lord and Dagon. Who is stronger, the Lord or Dagon? Who will Israel serve, the Lord or Dagon? And it all seems like Dagon is winning. Samson, who was supposed to deliver Israel, he's now dancing for Dagon. He's become the entertainment at Dagon's temple. That is until the Lord strengthens Samson one last time. And when he does that, that non-God Dagon cannot prevent his place of celebration becoming a massive cemetery for all his worshippers, can he? Because the Lord strengthens Samson one more time. Samson was literally the entertainment that brought the house down. We started with Samson, born of a barren womb. But we end with Samson, and he's made barren this place of worship. And he won't be the last, will he? Samson wouldn't be the last judge who was chosen and set apart before his birth. See, in the future, God will raise up a deliverer, not out of a barren womb, but out of a virgin womb. And at the end of that deliverer's life, he will stretch out his hands like Samson stretched out his hands. And they will be nailed to a tree. And in so doing, he will make barren all worship that doesn't center on him. See, unlike Samson, this deliverer will live a perfect life. Through his perfect life and his sacrificial death, Jesus will deliver his people from what? Sin. That sin that entangles, that sin that's the siren voice, that sin that lures us away, that sin that we've been talking about all the way through these chapters. So that if someone comes up to me and says to me, tell me about Jesus' death, I can say with delight, no, I'll not only tell you about his perfect death, but I'll tell you about his perfect life, because he is the perfect judge. Let's pray. Heavenly Father, we thank and praise you for this account recorded about the life and death of Samson, for all it teaches us about the dangers of sin, the subtlety of sin, and our folly in giving ourselves over to sin. Lord, we thank and praise you that all who trust in your name have been delivered from the punishment of sin and the wrath against sin through our great judge, the Lord Jesus Christ. But we pray, Heavenly Father, that you'll give us that wisdom and insight and strength that comes from your Spirit to be delivered from the presence of sin in our lives. It seeks to push us and pull us in every which way that it wants us to go, rather than walk in that faithful path. Lord, you have covenanted yourself to us through the blood of Christ. And there are, Lord, responsibilities on our part. Strengthen us by your Spirit to live a life that is pleasing to you, that your honor, your glory may be of greatest concern in our lives above and beyond our impulses and passions and desires. That at the end of our life, we might not be like Samson, just crying out that we might be revenged for our 2 hours, crying out for a last movement that our passions should be fulfilled. But our life will be one lived to seek your honor and glory, that your name might be spread abroad. Amen.